Down.
Welcome to ETSU Department of Psychiatry's Grand Rounds. We have Dr. Disque here today. He's going to be lecturing us on internal family systems therapy. He got his Bachelor of Arts from St. Andrew's Presbyterian College, his Master's in Human Development and Psychological Counseling from Appalachian State University, and his Ph.D. In Marriage and Family Therapy from Virginia Polytech Institute and State University. He's a tenured professor here in the Department of Counseling and Human Services here at ETSU.
Come on down to the first row if you're okay with that. You want to move on over here? You can leave your stuff there if you want. If you'd like, we're going to kind of just have an informal conversation around some things. Systems theory, there was Carl Whitaker and Tom Malone were some psychiatrists that were working at Emory University back in the 50s. And they worked almost exclusively in an inpatient setting with schizophrenics, and hospitals were set up a little differently back then. So you might have a patient who might be in there for a 45-day stay or something, so longer than people tend to stay now. And they were working with schizophrenics, and one of the things that they noticed was that when the schizophrenic had made a lot of progress and they sent the person home, oh, you know what? I forgot to do that thing. I was supposed to tell you all I'm getting no financial gain or benefit from being here. So that's what that disclosure statement is about. Yeah? Okay. So anyway, they were working with these clients, and what they noticed very oddly is when the person had made lots of gains, the person went back to the family. And when they went back to the family, usually within a 30-day period of time, they noticed one of two things seemed to be happening. That either all the symptoms returned to the person that had made all these gains, or they had another member of the family come to the hospital with some kind of psychological disturbance that they didn't have before. What do you make of that? So they pull the person out of the system, the person starts to improve, they put the person back into the system, and the person either maintained their gains, but then somebody else in the system got, quote, sick, or that person lost all the gain that they had. So they started to say, maybe we're treating symptoms, maybe we're identifying people with all these different diagnoses and looking at them as individuals, but they actually are part of a system, and that if we don't treat the system, then those gains aren't going to take hold. And so they said, well, maybe we should do something. This is the birth of family therapy. They said, maybe we should bring families in and start talking to families and see what happens. I've tracked some of this because I'm also curious about like adventure-based programs. And a similar thing happens with adventure-based programs. They take adolescents out for extended periods of time, and they live out in a wilderness kind of setting. They make all kinds of gains, and then when they come back home and they get back in the system, that they don't do so well when they return to the system. And things start to happen in the system when that person's gone. Another place that you might see this is that in working with addictions, it's a pretty common thing, that sometimes the person gets clean, they come back into the system, but the members of the system are used to that person being an addict, and they're used to interacting with them in particular patterns and ways, and they almost feel as if, it's not uncommon for them to say, it's almost as if the family wants me to return to my addiction, because we become very familiar with those patterns, and the patterns can have very strong pulls on us. So I also got, I got very interested in this system, so I went and got a Ph.D. in marriage and family therapy, and all of that approach was learning systems and looking at families as systems and how do they function. And when we started looking at that, they borrowed, oddly enough, from computers, and so they started looking at cybernetics, but they also started looking at something called general systems theory, and they used the way in which the body functions as a system, and they started noticing things like homeostasis and regulation and how different parts all come together, and in the way in which those parts come together say something about the health of the system. And I recently hurt myself in a bicycle thing, and I had inflammation, and so I had to lay on the couch for a few days. And I said, I wonder what the system is of inflammation. And it was so fascinating to me. I just put in inflammation, and all of a sudden, because I don't really have a background in biology, absolutely fascinating, the system that takes place with all these different cells coming to the site, and they're all contributing, and I don't even know how to pronounce half the names that's going on there, but there's histamines, and I'm probably not even pronouncing it right. Is it called phagocytes, or anybody know the proper term for that? But anyway, there's all these chemical processes that come together and function as a system. And when I got out and started trying to practice doing family therapy with people, I was armed with all this knowledge about how families can be enmeshed or chaotic, and you can study the structure and you can see where the structure is out of balance. But I didn't find it particularly effective in working with families, because kind of what they trained me to do was be an expert on how systems function, and then the family comes in and I'm going to do interventions and try to get them to change this and get them to change that. And you often got met with resistance because the families didn't like being treated just like a system. And a lot of family therapists came up with, and Milton Erickson came up with all kinds of ways to ask families to do things, even to the point where they said, we don't care whether the family understands it, we're just going to do this intervention, perturb the system, and the system's going to reorganize in some way, and it's going to function better. So again, the therapist just becomes the expert and tries to do things to families, and it wasn't my experience that families were particularly receptive about that. So I started doing much more individual therapy and less work with families. And then I started I had a particular client who came in. And one day, I'd been seeing her for a while, and one day her husband came with her. And he says, you know, when she comes in and sees you, she does really great for about 3 days. And after 3 days, she starts going downhill until she comes in and sees you again. And I don't know what you do in here, but something in here seems to really help her, but it only lasts for about 3 days. And I was like, darn, there's that systems thing popping up again. We're making progress, but then she's going back into a system that's kind of getting in the way of all of that. Because what a nice thing, trained as a counselor, you're going to give unconditional positive regard, acceptance. You're going to create this really nice, warm, loving environment, and people come in and they like all of that, and they feel good about that, but they don't necessarily know what to do with it and how to take it back out into a system that isn't going to treat them the way the nice therapist is treating them. So there's that piece of it. And then I also do groups. And there's a woman named Yvonne Augustarian who takes a systems-centered approach to working with groups. So my love for systems, I was able to say, oh, how can I apply this to working with groups? And one of the things that she quickly points out is that if a group is going to grow and develop, if there's any member of the group that does not have a sense of belonging and purpose and function and value in the group can only develop to a certain level. Does that make sense to you all? That if anybody's left kind of out and doesn't have a purpose and a function, the group will plateau and it'll just stay there. It can't until it can integrate all the different members of the group in some way, it can't function at its higher level. And again, I don't know enough about a biological system, but I would also say if there's some part of the system that's not integrated into the rest of the system as a whole, the system as a whole is going to fall out of balance, and that's when you might start to see some kind of disease or symptoms showing up. Okay? So, back to this, what am I going to do with my love for understanding systems, and how am I going to integrate it into working with people? This person, Richard Swartz, created something called internal family systems. And he was trained as a systems therapist, and he ran into some of the same problems in working with his clients that while he loved the theory, it didn't seem to always be helpful to the people that he was working with. And he had the idea of what if what we understand about how a system works, whether it's at the level of what's happening biologically or all the way to the largest systems of how we function as societies and governments, what if that same kind of thing, kind of in a fractal nature, is happening inside an individual? And that you're not treating a person, there's the person that lives in a system, but there's also a system that lives inside the person that is made up of different parts or different cells. And he kind of came to this by abandoning everything he had been taught and known. He said, I'm going to put all my theories aside, and I'm just going to start listening to my clients more carefully about how they talk about themselves and how they talk about their own experience. And you can tell me if this is true for you. It's certainly true for me. That when you listen quietly and get out of the way, it is not infrequent that clients will say, a part of me wants to do this. A part of me wants to do that. And that they feel this conflict, that there's these different parts. And even sometimes they'll say things like, I don't know how that happened. As if that some part came in and hijacked them and took them over for a short period of time. And maybe you yourself, I'm sure you do, have these experiences of like, oh my gosh, where did that come from? What part of me was saying that? How could I be this person who really values and loves my kids, and then this part came out and got so mad and angry and said something, and then I regret that I said that? Where did that come from? So as he started listening to his clients, he noticed that when they would say this part of me, whether it was a part that kind of hijacked them or a part that they wished could come out, as he started to listen more closely to those parts and really develop the stories that are behind those parts, he found that those parts were often trying to serve the person and protect the person in some way. And that what happened is that those parts can become so dominant that they become overprotective. And some of the parts are so dominant that the clients come to think that who they are is that part that's dominant. They become fused with the part that's dominant. Does that make sense to you that we can become so fused with something? I think an example of that is, anybody know the comedian Wanda Sykes? Yeah? So she's telling the story. She says, I'm at the mall, and I'm talking to my friend on the phone. And she says, she starts looking through her pocketbook, and she's talking to her friend. She says, I can't find my phone. I can't find my phone. I must have laid my phone somewhere down in the store. I don't know where it is. As she's talking to her friend. And she says, I can't talk anymore. I got to go try to find my phone. And the friend on the other end says, well, when you find it, call me. So we become so fused, and that a lot of these dominant parts get started early on in our lives. That we had something happen in our particular families. We grow up in certain kinds of cultures. And certain cultures, we may need to protect ourselves, or things that happen in our families, we may need to protect ourselves from those things. So we call forth some part to serve us. That part steps forward, And then sometimes it'll just stay there. And it gets started when we're children, and it stays with us so long that we kind of get fused with it and aren't really able to separate who we are from that particular part. And our language starts to contribute to that a little bit. Like, it's always been fascinating to me if we're talking about depression or anxiety, that our language invites people to say, I'm depressed or I'm anxious. And then they take a sense of the whole of who they are and they fuse it with that particular thing. But if I had leukemia, I wouldn't go up to people and say, I'm leukemia, I'm cancer. It would be, oh, there's this thing that's separate from me. But people will pick out certain aspects of their life, certain dominant things, and fuse with it to the sense that their identity, their whole sense of self, and the problem are one and the same thing. So some of the work in this internal family systems is to help people identify what is a dominant self and how can we begin to have some separation from that dominant self. So you and that are not the same thing. Narrative therapy talks about kind of a similar process. They talk about externalizing the problem. Because they notice that what happens is if the person thinks they're the problem and they're trying to do something to the problem, they end up attacking themselves. If you can see the problem is separate from you, it could feel very different to say, I have a dominant part, and start to see how you can be in relationship with that part is very different than when you're fused with it and your identity is connected with it. So one of the starting places with internal family systems is to begin to identify the dominant part and to begin to separate from it. So rather than giving you way too many things to think about today, what I wanted to do is see if we could just take the idea that when you're working with clients, you're not just working with an individual and you're not just working with a symptom, but that you're working with a system. There's a system inside that individual, and that we could start to see what that would open up as possibilities for us. So what I want to do is, I want you to, and I would need somebody, maybe somebody can help me out here, to write something on the board. You got to take care of the microphone, right? Somebody willing to write some things on the whiteboard for me? It'll be easy, I promise. You willing to write some things on the whiteboard for me? Okay. We're going to generate some possibilities, and all I want you to do is that when people call out some possibilities, we'll get them up there on the board. So I want you to imagine that somebody grows up in a culture, and when I say culture, a system, a family, a context, an environment, whatever words work for you, that has a dominance of guilt and shame. Can you imagine somebody growing up in an environment that has lots of guilt and shame? Because systems exist in other systems. Every system is within a system within a system, right? So an individual, we're saying they've got systems inside of them, but they grew up also in a system, and one system has an impact on another system. So if somebody grew up in a system of shame and guilt, and I want you to imagine that as an individual, I do have, and this helps me and I do this with clients, is if we think of it as a musical metaphor, and I have a whole orchestra of selves behind me, a whole possibility of just like different instruments, but it's different selves, different parts. And as a young person, I'm growing up in a family that has lots of shame and guilt. And it's painful for me, and I don't want to keep experiencing that pain. So I turn around to my orchestra of selves, and I say, would somebody come forth and protect me from this guilt and shame that I'm in contact with all the time? What do you think? There's no right answer here, and this is to me, the fun thing about this is that with clients, you get to discover the unique way in which they pull forth different parts and different selves to try to protect themselves. So let's see if we can generate some possibilities. What do you think are some selves that might be willing to step forward and protect this person from the guilt and shame that is bombarding them in the system that they're in? And all you got to do is write them down when they say them. Pardon? Yeah. Yeah. So the children want to be protected from their parents, right? Yes. Who's going to protect them from their parents? Let's say that they... From their parents, yes. So let me get you started to help you out. It could. Okay. So let me help you all get started with this. So again, we're thinking that this is happening inside. And I'm going to see if I can say how it might that might be true. That they themselves, the child, might try to imitate their parents or get very parental themselves. That makes sense to you? So they might have brothers and sisters, and then they get very parental. They get kind of parentified, and they take on positions that are really, and they're like, oh, if I act like a really good parent, or if I imitate my parents, then they won't shame and guilt me, and that would be a way for me to protect myself. Yeah? Is that making sense? Okay. Anybody? Let's generate a few others. Introvert. Okay. You want to say some more about how that might be that somebody would get introverted, that the introverted part of that person would come forward in order to protect them in some way? What would be the belief of that introvert?
If you're ashamed of yourself or parts of yourself, then you might want to try and hide those parts or make them less apparent.
Right. Okay. So if the people that are shaming me, tell me if I'm talking about the same way that you're talking about it, if the people that shame and guilt me, if they can see me, they might shame and guilt me. But if I can pull into myself, if I can make myself real small and don't speak and I'm not seen and I'm kind of hidden, then the chances are I won't have to experience the pain of some of that guilt and shame. So the introverted part of that person becomes a dominant self. It's a protector. Right? This making sense? Now again, with anything, just like, and one of the things that's crucial about this is that any of the parts that come forward, we're not pathologizing any of these parts. We understand that the parts just came forward originally to protect and serve the person. But what happens with anything that's protective, it can become overprotective. In the same way, a medicine can be a poison if the dose is too strong. So we take rat poison for heart conditions, right? People get Coumadin because it thins the blood. They don't have heart problems. But you get too much of it, a rat eats it, and hemorrhages to death, bleeds to death inside. So there's nothing about any of these parts that in and of themselves is particularly good or bad. It's the degree to which it starts to dominate and control the person's life. Okay? What other things do you think might happen, might show up for somebody who wants protection? Absolutely. Perfectionism, if some of you didn't hear what he said. So if I can do everything exactly right, if I get a 4.0 or higher, if they give something higher than that, and I'm going to do all my assignments just right, and I'm going to be the captain of the team, and I'm going to excel at all the things I can do, and I'm going to keep my room perfect. If I can do everything just right, if I can be perfectionist, that will protect me from the shame and guilt. Okay? Let's see what else.
Anger as a defect.
So the person might say, kind of flipping that around, the best defense is a good offense. And if I can control people with my anger or just show my anger, it might back people off, and they might realize, don't come around here with your shame and guilt because I'm not having any of it. And anytime anybody looks at me in a way that is negative, I might respond with anger. And so the anger is going to protect me. Yeah? Now, as I'm saying this, can you see that you have clients that, for example, you might have one client and they are so dominated by anger, and everybody wants to send them to an anger management group, and anger's the problem, but do you also have clients that they would benefit from having some anger? That what's happened is anger was not what they called forth, or the part that stepped forward and said that it would protect them, that anger is the last thing that that person might go to. Yeah? Okay. So again, it's not that anger is inherently good or bad, it's how it's functioning in the system, how it's connected to some of the other parts in the system. But if it's dominant and it's the only thing that keeps coming forward at the expense of other parts, then that becomes problematic. Okay? See if we can just generate some others. I won't talk as much about each one, but let's just see if we can generate. Self-destruction, self-sabotage. Yes. That's another kind of similar to what we were saying there, is self-sabotage, that you might be protecting yourself by beating people to the punch. You hear clients say this, nobody can be as hard on me as I am on myself. I like that. So, and again, at an extreme level, a very extreme level of that is that if being present is painful and I don't want to experience that pain, I could go all the way to getting catatonic. Yeah? So you're getting the sense that these things that pop up are, if we start to talk to clients about them and get more detail from it, what I've noticed is that something can start to shift. And this is a crucial thing because often what we're trained to think about is that the person's coming in with a symptom, and that when we identify this dominant part that's causing it's overprotective, that we might start thinking that we want to eliminate that part or control that part in some way. That's just a knee-jerk response that happens with us. And I'm going to invite you to consider not doing that. And Richard Swartz tells a terrific story about this. That when he first started doing this work, he had a patient that was cutting themselves. And he was very disturbed by that, and he wanted to be a good therapist that could get this person to stop cutting themselves. And they identified the part that was doing the cutting, and he tried to help the client get control over that part and block that part. And he felt pretty good about himself because he kind of got a little rough with that part, sent the client home, and the client comes back the next week, and they got a big gash down their face. That they went from cutting themselves in other parts of their body to doing that. And what he noticed is that if you have a part that is dominant, that part has usually been in control for a pretty long period of time. And that if you try to get that part to give up its control, it's not going to want to give up that control. And if we go back to the original notion that it first kind of came into existence in the person to serve the person, when he started having more conversations with that part of asking it what that part was wanting to do, what that part was afraid of, what that part's thinking was. So it's as if you have to get permission from the dominant part, and the dominant part has to feel heard and understood and validated before it might even consider stepping aside so that you can begin to integrate some of the other parts. Now, nobody mentioned this one. Let's just see if this is one that makes sense. That you might develop an inner critic. That makes sense? That would be kind of a common thing. And when I listen to people, that one is a pretty dominant voice that people have, that there's this part of themselves that's just constantly criticizing them, giving them a hard time, telling them that they could have done better. And what often people do is they try to win with the inner critic. And that is a lifelong attempt that never seems to work. inner critic, it's like, yes, you won the Nobel Prize, but it took you 25 years to do it. It's like you can't win with the inner critic. It's always going to be saying something like that. So again, the point of that is that when these dominant parts come out, the goal is not to defeat them or control them, but to begin to form a relationship with them. So let's imagine, because I think we can all kind of relate to this, that we have an inner critic, and you may wish you could get rid of your inner critic, but would that really be true? If I could give you a pill, no side effects, I just give you a pill, and that little nagging inner critic voice that seems to be able to tell you your body's not right, and you're not fit enough, or you're not the right weight, or your hair's not right, or you don't have the right degree, or the right job, or the right whatever, that inner critic that's just always ready to say something. If I could give you a pill, and that would disappear, would you take it? Anybody want that pill? I'll pull it out here, give it to you. Anybody want that pill? I don't see anybody saying anything. Why would you not want to take it? Exactly. Yes. So if we were like highly, highly identified with that particular thing, it would be equal to death. Maybe a symbolic level, but we think, oh, if I give that up, yes, then I'm just going to die. I'm so identified with that particular protector part. Yeah. Yes, yes. So if you got rid of your inner critic, you might have some motivation in your life that just disappears. Yes. So what starts to shift with clients is that they often come in and they say, there's this thing and I need to change this and I want to wrestle it to the ground and I want to get rid of it, or can you give me a drug that'll make it go away, or some strategy? And what this is saying is, let's look at this very thing that you want to get rid of, and what if instead we look at what your relationship is with it, and we listen to it, and that dialed down to the correct amount, it could be giving me motivation. But if it's too much, then I'm constantly burning myself out and never feeling good, and I'm never getting there, and it's never enough. There's nothing inherently good or bad about the inner critic. It's the relationship that you have with it. Now, the inner critic, let's go back to the fear of shame and guilt. If I'm the inner critic and I want to talk to the rest of you, and I say, if you don't keep me around, what do you think the inner critic would try to tell you would happen if you don't let it continue to run the show? Because that's what happens when one becomes dominant. It's running the show, and the person's fused with it. How do you think the inner critic would scare you into saying, you need to stay with me and you need to let me stay in charge? What would it tell you is going to happen if it doesn't stay in charge?
You won't stay successful if I'm not telling you how to do it right.
I would say it would go even further than that. I agree with you. It would say, you're not going to be successful if you don't listen to me. But it could say, you're going to be living in a dumpster back behind the store, and you're just going to get lazy, and you're going to lay around on the couch and do nothing but eat bonbons. And if you don't let me be in charge, it tells you you're going to go all the way to the other end of the continuum, and that's where you're going to be. And so the person's like, well, I got two choices in life. I either let my inner critic keep running my life and driving me and whipping me around, making me do all these things, or I'm going to be over here and my life's going to be a complete disaster, and I'm going to be homeless and destitute and da-da-da. So it becomes very hard for the person to make that shift to even considering, maybe I could do something else. Because they go right to the polarity. Anybody have another thing that the inner critic might try to tell you? why you need to listen to it. What would the inner critic be most afraid of, for example? If you had a bunch of other, because you got all these other instruments back here in the symphony, what parts do you think that the inner critic would be most afraid of if you started paying attention to that?
Apathy?
Apathy?
Yeah, if you don't care what your critiques are, then what use is the critique?
So that's what it would say to you. You better not start talking to those parts, because apathy might come in and take over. Yeah. Okay. Yes. 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 Right. And often what the person is giving, they feel like is, I'm getting a pretty good deal, because if I had to choose between the inner critic and apathy, I'll take the inner critic. So they don't want to let go of the inner critic. Yeah? So let's see if we could create something in our minds. It might be outside the mind for the client at first. But if you're highly controlled by the inner critic, and you don't have to go all the way to that complete polarized thing that you're being frightened by, what do you think could be something other than an inner critic? Like, what parts of you would not get to really come out and play and express themselves if you were dominated by an inner critic? So let's see if there's some positive ones. Self-love. Right. Does hopefulness fit? Yeah, so if I'm dominated by an inner critic, am I going to be able to access self-love, acceptance, hopefulness? No. And often it's so outside the client's mind, because they're so dominated by that particular one, that they don't know that they could have the opportunity to tap into some of those other parts. So instead of trying to fight the inner critic, you form a relationship with the inner critic, you find out from the inner critic, you let it talk, you find out what its fears are, why it originally showed up, why it's trying to protect you. And I often find that just that in and of itself is often a very big shift. And this can happen early in the session, that the person went from coming in wanting to get rid of something to realizing, oh, it's here to serve me, and that shift begins to happen in the relationship. And then at some point, what they do in internal family systems is when that dominant part has been identified and it feels heard, we ask that part to step aside, and we see what could emerge, what becomes possible if that part steps aside, what else could come forward. So imagine yourself as a conductor of an orchestra. If you just had somebody back there just banging on the kettle drums or the cymbals, or they were just playing their trumpet really loud, it's dominating the whole orchestra. And what you start to do with internal family systems is, as the person begins to separate from the dominant self, they realize they have a self that's separate from that dominant thing. That's a crucial step in it. And when they realize they're separate, and that they could then begin to balance the dominance of that as it steps aside. And you literally ask the client, would it be okay if that part were to step aside? Or sometimes with clients they'll say, what if we took that part and just put it in a soundproof room for a minute? We're going to let it back in, but for just a minute, let's see what happens if we put that in, and what other parts might come forward. And they're amazed that self-love, hopefulness, and sometimes they haven't been in touch with those parts in such a long period of time that they've forgotten that they even have that. And then as those parts come forward, they begin to be able to have a relationship with that. And internal family systems calls that part an exiled part. So the parts that we were not safe to stay in touch with. So if we go back to the shame and guilt, and you're a child that's growing up in a culture of shame and guilt, you think that it felt very good to let yourself get in touch with hopefulness? Would you feel more pain or less pain if you let yourself be hopeful growing up in a culture of shame and guilt? Probably you would have more pain. Yes, I let myself be hopeful. And it's funny because counselors are doing this, therapists are doing this with people all the time. They're working with kids and they're inviting these kids, oh, have a more positive attitude, be more hopeful. But they're not paying attention to this dominant part and how frightened they are, because if you let yourself be hopeful and then you're met with shame and guilt, it just hurts all that much more. So later as adults, we're still stuck in some of these patterns that we developed to survive the systems that we were in. Now as adults, we're overly fused with that. That part is overdeveloped, and parts that go undeveloped or exiled aren't as accessible to us. And so what we're really doing is helping people start to bring forth different instruments in the orchestra. See if we can generate another one. Anybody else have another one? If you were free, think of yourself when you're free of the inner critic. When were you the most free of your inner critic? Anybody tell me where you were, what you might be doing, when you have moments where the inner critic just doesn't seem to be there? Can you imagine that in your life? I'll be patient. I can wait. Somebody give me one example of when you feel most free from your inner critic. I'm hoping you all have ways to get free of your inner critic from time to time. When you're focusing on somebody else, your inner critic disappears, yeah. Okay. Now, that in and of itself could become something that's dominant. And I don't know you, so I don't know, so take what I'm going to say with a grain of salt. But could you see how that could become such a dominant thing that you spend your life always focusing on other people, always focusing on other people, because that's where it feels good, and that is a nice way to balance the inner critic out. But then, kind of like you said, if you're not careful, this turns into the new pathology, the new over-dominance of something. And so what we begin to work with the clients is this, as they develop these counterparts to the dominant parts, that they integrate those in a way that ultimately what we're looking for is that this internal family system is a system that's coming into harmony, that's coming into balance of these different selves. And I would suggest that some of the things that we're calling pathologies, when we're calling something anxiety or depression, the things that we diagnose things for, that when you start to use language of calling them particular parts and particular dominant parts, and the clients can then be in relationship with those parts, and they can look at what are the polarities to those parts and how to start to call those forth, that kind of language makes much more sense to clients. And I find that they beat themselves up less and have less shame about some of those things and less over-identified with those kinds of things when they realize, oh, I've got this symphony of selves, symphony of parts inside me that I can start to regulate. And what begins to happen, and this is what Richard Swartz calls the ultimate goal, is that you develop, that is what a self is. The self is not the particular parts. The self is what is orchestrating the different parts. And when I listen to clients, they've often not been living their lives with a sense of self. What they've been doing is they're jumping from one part to another part. Does that make sense to you all? That's often when they're talking about their experience. So when they say, part of me is this and part of me is this, it's just they're like letting other parts take turns driving the bus and driving into different things. And they don't have a sense of being able to tell the parts what they want. So often what happens when we start getting these parts, I'll say something to them that's similar to this. I'll say, imagine these two competing parts and they come to you and you're a movie director. And these two parts turn to you and they say, how do you want us to be in relationship? How are we supposed to play this out? That is such a new concept for them. They're just used to which part's going to take me over today or in this moment in this situation, as opposed to you're giving leadership to the parts and saying, I want this from you in this way, and then there's other parts that have been very dominant, and it's not uncommon for clients to say to that part, I really have gratitude for you. I really appreciate how you kept me alive. I appreciate all that you did for me, but I'm a different age now, and I'm in a different relationship, and I don't need you in the same way that I needed you before. Would you be willing to just, I'll check in with you, but would you be willing to serve me in this particular way? And they start getting more clear and developing more leadership about what they want from these different parts. And so they start being able to create kind of a music in their own lives that is more fitting to the kind of music that they want to have. So they're less at the mercy of these parts running their lives. All right, so it's 11:45, and I was going to give you an opportunity we'll do a little experiential exercise, kind of a guided meditation, and I'll give you an opportunity to try this out for yourself, and then we'll see if you want to have some discussion about what happens after you do this little guided meditation. So go ahead and get yourself in a relaxed position. And it's funny, I've noticed that whenever I say that, everybody starts moving like they weren't in a relaxed position before. So get yourself in a relaxed position, take several deep breaths, and imagine that you are at the base of a path. It can be any path, one you are familiar with or one you have never been on before. Before you go anywhere on the path, meet with your emotions and thoughts, i.e. your parts, at the base and ask that they remain there and allow you to head out on the path without them. If they are afraid to let you go, reassure them that you won't be gone long and that both they and you will benefit from the experience. See if you can arrange for any scared parts to be cared for by those that aren't scared. If parts remain afraid to let you go, don't go, and instead spend some time discussing their fears with them. Exactly what are they afraid will happen if they allow you to go off on your own? If, however, you sense permission to go, head out on the path. Notice as you go whether you are watching yourself on the path or whether you are on it such that you don't see yourself. You just see or sense your surroundings. If you are watching yourself, that's a signal that a part is present. Find that part that's afraid to let you proceed on the path and ask it to relax and return to the base. If it won't, spend time exploring its fears. As you continue on the path, notice whether you are thinking about anything. If you are, ask those thoughts to return to the base as well, so that you increasingly become pure awareness. As you continue on the path, check periodically to see if you are thinking, and if so, gently send the thoughts back. As each part leaves you, notice what happens to your body and mind. Notice the amount of space you sense around you and the kind of energy that flows in your body. When it feels as if you have spent enough time on the path away from your parts, begin to return to the base. See if it is possible to hold the spaciousness and energy you feel, even as you get close to your parts again. When you arrive at the base, meet with your parts and see how they fared without you and what they might need from you. When that process is complete, thank your parts for letting you go if they did. If they didn't, thank them for letting you know they were afraid to let you go. Then take some deep breaths again and follow your breath back into the room, back into the outside world. All right. Anybody willing to share what they noticed at the exercise? Yes?
When you were talking about the two paths, the familiar path, I felt that the emotions let me go on that path because they knew I would be
Yes,
okay.
they're fine with you going down that path, familiar path.
But then when you go on to the unknown path, that's when the fears and anxieties started kicking in. Like, you can't go that way. We don't know what's there. It's the fear of the unknown, the uncertainty that kept pulling back, and you couldn't shake the thoughts. You couldn't shake the fears. Even if you sat with your emotions, you're like, listen, it's going to be okay. We have to continue onward. We have to see where this path leads.
Yes.
And then it's, well, we don't know if it's going to be a good path or a bad path. What if it's a bad path? And then
Yes.
just the continuation of, listen, we're going to be okay. We're going to keep walking. It's going to be fine. And then
Yes.
it's still the fear of the unknown, the anxiety that's
Yes.
almost crippling to a certain extent.
Yes, it's almost crippling to think of going down the path of the unknown. Yes, to go down a path of new possibilities. Yeah. Okay, if I ask you another question about that? So were there ways, and then we would, we're abbreviating all of this tremendously and going very quickly, but was there one particular part that was more frightened than the other parts?
Kind of, in a way.
Yeah.
It was mainly the uncertainty.
Yes, the part of uncertainty.
That it just kept screaming, you can't.
You can't. Yes, it's like screaming. You're like, in its mind, you're going off the edge
Yeah.
of the cliff to your death.
And just all the thoughts that uncertainty brought with it just would not shut up. They would not mute themselves no matter how much you try to tell them, it's okay, go back, it's all right, I'm fine.
Yes.
The uncertainty kept saying, no, you are not fine. You
Yes.
can't do this. You
Yes.
can't do this.
Yes. And so if we were working together, I'm working with a client, and similar things show up with clients, is that we would spend a lot of time listening and reassuring that uncertainty that it had a place and a purpose and a value in your life. Because what often happens is the part feels like when you want to move on and do something new, that part thinks that you're abandoning it forever.
Right.
And so you need to really go slow and reassure the person that, oh, if you need to bring that back in, it's always going to be there. And it's been my experience with clients is that when I simply ask them, do you think that part will ever really abandon you? They're like, no, I don't have to even worry. The thing that I'm worried about is how it's overpowering and dominating. So this fear that it's going to abandon me and it won't be there. So you want to have, and this is where we would start to look more closely, is that there's a reason that we don't go just blindly into things, that there's a part that says don't go where it's uncertain, but the client begins to have a relationship with that where it's like, oh, I can value what you're doing, but I don't have to be driven by you. Like an analogy that often comes up with clients is, could you imagine having a smoke detector in your house, that smoke detector is so sensitive that if somebody walks down the street in front of your house with a cigarette, your smoke detector goes off? But it feels like that for some people, that some parts are so dominant and so sensitive. So we talk about how to dial it back. We're not talking about yanking the battery out of the smoke detector and getting rid of it. It's dialing it back down. So you really want to have a part of you that's saying, when I'm uncertain, I don't, freeze, don't go, don't keep moving down there. but you don't want to be paralyzed by it. So we would take a lot of time to work through that, and then once we have some reassurance and permission from that part, then we would start looking into bringing forth some other things that might be possibilities and enrich the person's life. Thank you so much for sharing that. Anybody else either want to share something from the exercise or ask any kind of question that you might have about this model or how to put it into practice or anything like that?
I'll share, I'm not shy.
Okay, terrific.
As I'm going down the path, leaving these dominant parts, I was picturing myself skipping and singing the Smurfette song, like Smurfette,
Yeah, right.
what are they called? The Smurfs. Okay, I'm singing the Smurf song.
Yeah.
I am happy. I'm getting away from them.
Yes.
The reality was I had to turn around. And as I'm
Yes.
getting closer, the skipping is stopping.
Yes.
Because the reality is
Yes.
they will always be there, and I have to pick them up again, and I do have to go back to them.
Yes. I love that. And that's such a great point when that happens with clients, because the thing that they've been trying to numb themselves, parts they've been numbing themselves to with alcohol or drugs or over-focus on work or over-involvement in their kids or whatever it is, that they're hoping that there's these parts that they can be successful in distracting themselves from or running away from. And in that moment where you realize, it's like I was saying with the group, if there's some members of the group that don't have a place and they don't belong and they don't know their purpose and their function, you know that as yourself, you can't fully develop by just running away from those parts. And you had that moment of turn and you realize they're with me whether I like them or not, so I might as well learn how to get into relationship with them in a way that's really going to serve me. Yeah, fantastic story. Thank you for sharing. All right. Anybody else have anything? Yes, please.
Not enough for everybody to hear me, but I think if we change going or walking down a path to flying over a path, that would be a much better experience because there is freedom inherent to flight.
Yes, I like that. So I don't know if I would put in just flying, but I like the idea of saying to people that you could be walking or flying or running or however way you choose to go down that path. And my head just went into like snorkeling because I love to snorkel, that I'd be swimming away from something and leaving some of that behind. So, and that's the beauty of all of this, is that it's not a set thing that you need to identify this and it means that. You're just working with the clients, and that's where it originated, was from him listening to clients. So let your clients tell you what the names of the parts are and tell you about how it has served them. We're just asking questions so they become more aware of how these parts are functioning in their lives and beginning to separate from them and beginning to take a sense of leadership of those parts in their life. Thank you. All right. I think we're at the end. I really appreciate your willingness to engage me in conversation. And if any of you want to be trying some of this out and playing around with it, you can email me. I'm at ETSU. It's my last name is Disque, D-I-S-Q-U-E, at etsu.edu. I'm happy to correspond with you or talk with you if you're curious about how you might put some of this into practice with people. So thank you all very much.